Another celebrated syndrome, the irritable bowel. This too is distressing but not life-threatening, difficult to define, and of uncertain cause. As a gastroenterologist, Professor Michael Farthing of St Bartholomew's Hospital sees many patients with the irritable bowel syndrome and had begun to notice that a disproportionate number of them also suffered from chronic fatigue. To test this observation, he organised a survey of people belonging to a patient support group called Action for ME. Using a questionnaire, he was able to find out how many people with chronic fatigue also suffered from irritable bowel movements and the other core features of the syndrome. He presented his findings at a meeting organised last week by the British Society of Gastroenterology.
Well, we found that really a very high proportion, something over 3/4, had got symptoms which were indistinguishable from the irritable bowel syndrome. If we used even stricter criteria, we found that over 60% had. Now, those numbers on their own perhaps don't mean very much, but if I was to say that we'd done a community survey in the City of London last year, when we found that only 17% of a business community in the city had got these sorts of symptoms, I think it gives you a feel for how large those numbers are.
There is, of course, both in the chronic fatigue syndrome and in irritable bowel syndrome, a kind of a dispute that goes on between whether on the one hand it's primarily an organic disorder and on the other hand primarily a psychological disorder. Now that is a very crude polarity to draw, but do your findings tend to push one in either direction of that polarity?
I think we're looking at people who have got perhaps a background susceptibility to developing symptoms in certain organ systems. And certainly if you look at patients with irritable bowel, you can find motor abnormalities in their gut.
That's abnormalities of the muscles. And
abnormalities of the muscles and the speed at which the gut works, and perhaps also abnormalities in the way pain and other sensations are perceived from the gut. Evidence, for instance, suggesting that certain parts of the gut are more sensitive to, say, distension by a balloon. Now, what I believe is that there may be some, if you like, peripheral abnormality, but this is probably heightened by abnormalities of central control mechanisms, by which I mean changes in the mood, changes in which we see life and the way we feel about ourselves can have a major influence on the way in which we perceive things going on in the rest of our body. And I think if we're feeling good and healthy and well, that is, perhaps we're looking at life through rose-tinted spectacles, we would tend to ignore symptoms such as disturbances of our bowels or abdominal pain. I think if we're feeling low and tired and miserable and generally worried about ourselves, then maybe we see life through blue-tinted spectacles, and that everything becomes rather sad and interrupts the way in which we get on with life normally, and abdominal symptoms then come to the foreground.
It might sound from that as if you're saying it's all in the mind.
Well, I'm not. Clearly, abdominal pain and bowel frequency and changes in bowel habit are very much in the abdomen and in the bowel, very much in the same way that people with tired muscles and weak muscles, it's very much in the muscles. What I think that I do believe, however, is the way we feel and what goes on in our brain alters the way in which we feel about our muscles and our bowels. And we cannot look at one, I believe, without looking at the other. The two are together, and I think there are many people who would argue that, in fact, you can't separate them.
Professor Michael Farthing. With me are two more doctors who have an interest in the causes of the chronic fatigue syndrome. They are Dr. Charles Shepherd, medical advisor to another patient support group, the ME Association, and Dr. Simon Wesley of the Institute of Psychiatry. Simon Wesley, let me begin with you. What do you make of Professor Farthing's findings, this overlap between the chronic fatigue syndrome and that of the irritable bowel?
Yes, I'm not at all surprised by the findings. It accords with our own clinical experience. Most patients we see with CFS in the clinic could equally well be classified as having irritable bowel syndrome, whereas when we do gastroenterology clinics, we find the converse. Most patients with irritable bowel also have abnormal fatigue, muscle pain, and so on. So the overlap's not surprising. I think what was particularly welcome was to hear a physician making such a strong case for the inseparability of psychological and physical factors. I think that was extremely welcome.
Because that's the way you see it, that you can't really meaningfully separate the two.
Yes, I think that's right. Professor Farthing was talking about, for example, the role of the central nervous system, the role of the brain in integrating sensations, both from muscles, from bowel, and one could equally add from the heart, from the chest, and various other organ systems, and how it may well be that a central disorder of perception may underlie all these symptoms that otherwise would be inexplicable.
Right, Charles Shepherd, what do you make of Professor Farthing's findings? findings?
Again, with Simon, I would agree that clinically a lot of patients with ME, chronic fatigue, do have irritable bowel symptomatology. And it was interesting, he was talking about this central-peripheral link, and I think there are probably factors in both which could be accounting for this. We know that patients with ME have a lot of what we call autonomic disturbances.
That's disturbances one branch of the nervous
That's
system.
one branch of the nervous system coming from the brain, particularly areas like the hypothalamus, where we know there are disturbances in this disorder already, and these go to the bowel, the heart, etc., etc. So there may be central factors. Additionally, in the sort of post-infectious patients that we're talking about, there's some evidence come from Professor Mowbray that viruses like enteroviruses may be persisting in the gut, so this could be a local factor involved in this. And I'd also add that one thing about these patients who present with a lot of irritable bowel symptomatology in ME, I think it's worth considering that they don't have some sort of other gastrointestinal infection like a Giardia, which can sometimes set this syndrome off.
Kind of a small parasite that lives in the gut.
Yes, which can set this syndrome off, and it can also set an irritable bowel syndrome off.
Right, now, the two of you there started out fairly close, because both of you seem to be fairly sympathetic towards what Professor Farthing was saying, but I get an impression already from what you were saying, particularly Charles Shepherd, there's a divergence creeping in, because you're beginning to emphasise organic factors, beginning to talk about things like viruses and so on. What do you think is at the root of the problem in most people with chronic fatigue, ME, whatever you want to call it?
There's no simple answer to that. I think it's a question of triggering factors and perpetuating factors. We're looking at some interesting triggering factors, which I think are viruses, immunisations, neurotoxins, things that are toxic to the nervous system. We're looking at perpetuating factors, which include the sort of things Simon's interested in. I would thoroughly agree, psychosocial factors, but also, do viruses persist? Are there abnormalities in the immune system? What's going wrong in the brain, particularly the hypothalamic pituitary axis, and possibly is there things going wrong in the muscle mitochondria?
By the factors which perpetuate the condition, you're talking, that might include, for example, all kinds of emotional distress and so on, which are a result of the condition once it had first appeared. But what first triggers it, you think, in most cases, is an organic factor, a virus, something like that?
The illness we're talking about, ME, post-viral fatigue syndrome, we believe is triggered by some sort of organic, as I say, virus, infection, immunisation, neurotoxin.
Right, what about that? And Simon Wesley?
I was actually just reflecting on what you said about the difference between organic and psychological. Charles was talking about autonomic dysfunction, the overactivity of certain nervous systems, which is absolutely right. Psychiatrists listening to that would say, well, that's probably anxiety, and that's what we would call anxiety, with palpitations, tachycardia, shortness of breath. We're obviously talking about exactly the same thing. We have two different semantic language ways of looking at the same problem, which is what Professor Farthing was saying. Similarly, we're again talking about the same thing here. Undoubtedly, the vast majority of patients I see have their illness triggered by a virus. I mean, they were well, they got a virus, and now they're sick. Equally undoubtedly, what's keeping them sick may not be that virus in the first place. So the virus may have started something off. Other factors, depression, becoming unfit, demoralization, all sorts of other factors may be responsible for why they're ill many years later. Again, there's no contradiction between the two views. What starts something may not be what keeps it going.
But would you actually accept that the majority of patients who get this label as ME, what really started the whole thing off in the first place was not that they were chronically depressed or stressed or neurotic, but an actual virus came in and interacted with an actual immune system and did something?
Again, Jeff, you can't separate that out. Most of the patients I see, when you take the history from them, they say, I had a virus, but it happened at a particular time, normally out of coat, but I was under a period of, to use a popular term, stress. I was very stressed at work or marriage or something like that. And many patients have very complicated views of why they got ill. They said, I'm quite sure I'd have been okay, I'd have had, a couple of weeks off with the flu, but because of these other problems, I then got ill.
Well, can you go along with that, Charles Shepherd?
Simon's delving into another area which I would call cofactors. At the time of the virus, I think he's quite right. Stress is quite an important factor, particularly patients who are under a lot of physical, mental stress. Maybe that affects the immune system's ability to cope with that virus. If stresses go on in the course of the illness, if your family isn't believing you can't get your benefits and everything else, that's a very important, sort of what we might call psychosocial factor for keeping the disease going. So we're having areas of agreement and disagreement on perhaps the same topics.
The problem, Simon Wesley, and you should address it as a psychiatrist, that many patients, when the doctor says, oh, it's all in your mind, simply feel that this is the doctor washing his hands of them. He doesn't really want to know. And I know for a fact that some doctors actually don't even believe in this syndrome at all, do they?
That's absolutely true. When doctors say that type of thing, that's exactly what they are implying, that it is all in the mind. They don't believe it, that it's hysterical or malingering. There's no evidence of that at all. However, I would certainly say that psychological factors as I've just mentioned, are very important. I hope no doctor ever talks to a patient and says your problem's all in the mind. I don't really know what that means, to be honest.
Well, finally, to you, Charles Shepherd, do you foresee a time when there is going to be some sort of measure of complete agreement among doctors about the nature of this disorder, or is this going to go on?
Well, I would hope so, but at the moment the debate is going to go on. It's very friendly here. I'm afraid it's not so friendly elsewhere.
and when that is the case, it's the patients who suffer, of course.
It's the patients who suffer, and the patients at the moment, they can't get their benefits because certain adjudicating officers say, no, you've got a psychosocial problem, no benefits.
There we must wrap it up. Dr. Shepherd, Dr. Wesley, thank you both very much.